Mr. Gossel for Mrs. Glukak, seconded by Mr. Sorensen, moves that Bill C-40, an act respecting the Rouge National Urban Park, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour and a pleasure to rise in this House today on this historic occasion, the third reading of the Rouge National Urban Park Act. But before I get to the good news, I find I must speak to the fact that the past hour has been wasted by another example of legislative vandalism by the official opposition, by the NDP. I'm told that it might have been a mistake in signals, and I suppose we have to consider that. But I think this is just the latest in a long-running example in both committee and here in the House, in debates in this House, where the NDP has obstructed, undercut, and, as I say, partaken of legislative vandalism in the House. Now to the good news. The Government of Canada, Mr. Speaker, is proudly embarking on a Canadian first, a new kind of national protected area within Canada's largest metropolitan area. Indeed, the creation of Rouge National Urban Park is a proud and historic achievement not only for all the residents of the Greater Toronto Area, for all of Ontario, but for Canadians right from coast to coast. Rouge National Urban Park, which is a Canadian first, builds on an incredible legacy of pioneering and innovative conservation work undertaken for over a century, Mr. Speaker, by Parks Canada. In 2011, the year of Parks Canada's centennial, the agency was awarded the Gift to the Earth Award by a Mr. Gerald Butts, who was then of the World Wildlife Federation International. As colleagues know now, he's working on a recovery effort for another endangered species, but that's another story. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the creation of Rouge National Urban Park is an immensely proud occasion for all Ontarians and Canadians, and it helps to position Canada at the forefront of the world's emerging urban protected areas movement. Rouge National Urban Park will be one of the planet's largest and most significant urban protected areas, providing a sanctuary of protected and restored forests, marshes, wetlands, farmlands, and centuries-old cultural landscapes alongside the Greater Toronto Area's rich cultural diversity. This bill, Mr. Speaker, allows more land to be added over time, which will eventually make this wonderful park 25% larger than the current protected area, making it 13 times larger, no offense intended to my colleagues from British Columbia, but more than 13 times larger than Vancouver's Stanley Park, 16 times larger than New York City's Central Park, and 33 times larger than London's Hyde Park. Rouge National Urban Park will be a shining example, Mr. Speaker, of the very best of Canada, because it brings together and enshrines in legislation the protection and the celebration of three things that define us as Canadians and speak to the very essence of Canada, our nation's national, cultural and agricultural heritage. While integrating the protection of nature, culture and agriculture in a new and bold approach, I want to make clear, Mr. Speaker, that the Rouge National Urban Park provides us with a strong legislative framework to meet, to exceed and to expand upon the protections and mandate currently in place to protect and manage smaller portions of the Rouge by a variety of public land owners. Now, protecting nature, culture and agriculture together does not mean, as some have implied, that protection of natural resources is somehow diminished, nor does it mean that there are no priorities, nor that the Rouge is trying to be everything to everyone. This is simply not true. Those who suggest such scenarios do not understand the Rouge Park's urban setting, the needs of its landscape mosaic, or the opportunity to demonstrate true leadership internationally. Having been asked by the Rouge Park Alliance, which, Mr. Speaker, as you know, has been for years managed the lands which are currently called the Rouge Park, to find a solution to the governance and the conflicts that were making park management impossible, Parks Canada began consulting with thousands of Canadians and with hundreds of groups and organizations representing stakeholders, communities, non-governmental organizations and governments. Through the process, the government has determined that an integrated approach is the most appropriate for the Rouge, an approach that has three very clear, interconnected priorities when it comes to protection, nature, culture, and, again, agriculture. This model is what Canadians and the Rouge Park Alliance, the former provincially appointed managing authority of Rouge Park, have asked for. And this approach, Mr. Speaker, will allow us to make the very best conservation gains across the entire park landscape in ways that allow for the Rouge's natural, cultural, and agricultural resources to receive the highest level of protection now and far into the future. The Government of Canada's integrative and inclusive approach will allow us to succeed where the previous disparate park authorities and regimes have not before. While there has been some certainly wonderful work done to protect the Rouge over the last 20 years, there have also been divergent and sometimes conflicting interests in the lands that make up the future Rouge National Urban Park. During that time, no single legal regime governed these lands, and at times the voices of many groups and residents were not reflected in policy development and park management. Nature, culture, and agriculture and visitor connection opportunities were seen often as competing rather than complementary priorities. Now, when this bill came to committee earlier this month, Mr. Speaker, one of the witnesses that we heard from was the Honourable Pauline Browse, the Director of Waterfront Regeneration Trust Corporation, and, as you know, a former Federal Minister of State for the Environment. Mrs. Browse gave the committee some of the history of the creation of the Rouge Park, and she stated, and I will quote her, Mr. Speaker, she stated that every municipality in the Rouge watershed passed a motion endorsing the proposal, as well as the TRCA, to urge the federal government to establish a national park. The Government of Ontario publicly and enthusiastically supported that recommendation. The community supported that recommendation. Mrs. Browse continued, "The legislation is now before you. Parks Canada, a heralded organization of experience and highly competent individuals, has been assigned the responsibility of the permanent protection and preservation of the natural, cultural, and agricultural aspects of the Rouge National Urban Park. In particular," Mrs. Browse pointed out, "I would like you to look at the clauses 4 and 6. I've read the arguments that have been made in the House of Commons, but the language of these two clauses is clear and self-explanatory. These clauses," she said, "will allow the Minister to make the decisions based on the identified purpose for which the park is being created and the factors which must be taken into consideration. Pitting the elements against each other by putting one as a priority would really," she said, "create conflict. I would ask you," Mrs. Browse said to the committee, "to consider the natural, cultural, and agricultural aspects, and I mean the cultural aspects with Aboriginal issues and the archaeological issues. When I was a member," she said, "we did some archaeological digs in the park, and we found a 17th century French coin. There's a lot of cultural heritage within this park." That's the end of Mrs. Browse's quote. Now, with Bill C-40, Mr. Speaker, Parks Canada, through the Minister of the Environment, will be given the responsibility to bring all groups together and to work for the betterment of Rouge National Urban Park to ensure a broad range of perspectives is heard. and nature, culture, and agriculture are all valued, celebrated, but most important, protected to the full extent of the law. Our government's approach will see everyone with a stake or an interest in this wonderful new national park to work together, where a win for nature will also be a win for agriculture and for the cultural landscapes of the park. In practical terms, this means that Parks Canada will apply its world-renowned approach to conserving biodiversity and restoring native wildlife and ensuring the health of the park's ecosystems through rigorous monitoring of the park's flora, fauna, waters, and soil. Parks Canada will work with farmers to end the cycle of one-year leases and initiate a leasing regime that will foster economic stability. And the farmers will, in turn, Mr. Speaker, work to manage farmlands in an ecologically sound fashion and to commit to conserving resources and contributing to visitor experience and cultural heritage of the park. Integral to all of this, as it is and has been emphasized in the bill, is the fact that Parks Canada will manage for the health of ecosystems and apply this concept across all of the park's ecosystems, landscapes, and resources in a way that not only protects and restores natural and cultural heritage, but also promotes a healthy and vibrant farming community. This new type of protected area cannot, as some have requested, be managed for ecological integrity. The fact that over 75%, more than 75% of the park's intended area, Mr. Speaker, have been altered or disturbed by civilization. The fact that it is in close proximity to Canada's largest metropolis, and the fact that it comprises a variety of landscapes and uses, all of this makes the concept of ecological integrity simply inappropriate for the Rouge. Instead, this unique protected area calls for this new approach to conservation. In fact, and going back to testimony before committee, when the bill was before committee earlier this month, one of the witnesses we heard from, Mr. Larry Noonan, with Altona Forest Stewardship, said, and I will quote, "Some people have asked why the term ecological integrity is not in the Act. The Canada National Parks Act," he said, states that ecological integrity includes supporting processes. As a further clarification, as part of this definition, Parks Canada defines ecosystem processes as the engines that make ecosystems work, e.g., he said, fire, flooding, etc. Mr. Noonan continued, "Ecological integrity cannot be applied to a national urban park." And I'll say that again. Mr. Noonan was very clear, and he has the authority to stand behind these words. Ecological integrity cannot be applied to a national urban park. We cannot allow fires and flooding in the Toronto, Markham, and Pickering urban environment, he said. The Rouge National Urban Park Act cannot have this term included, or there would have to be a list of exceptions to the definition, which could serve to lessen its impact in the Canada National Parks Act. And we've seen in some of the Ontario legislation, which has been erroneously referred to, I'm just stepping aside from Mr. Noonan's quotes here for a moment, Mr. Speaker, there are loopholes in Ontario's Act which basically allow any number of events to take place which would have profound negative impact on both the protected area itself, but also upon wildlife, upon archaeological realities, First Nations realities, and certainly upon the agricultural component of this unique new entity. Now, Mr. Noonan continued, after saying ecological integrity cannot be applied to a national urban park, the Rouge National Urban Park Act cannot have this term included. Instead, Bill C-40, he pointed out, refers to the maintenance of its native wildlife and of the health of those ecosystems. The Rouge National Urban Park, he said, and the management plan layout strategies for attaining the highest possible level of health for this park's ecosystems. That is the end of Mr. Noonan's quote before committee. Now, as well, Mr. Speaker, and I won't go into the list at this point, but we heard from many other witnesses who did not believe that ecological integrity was even achievable within Rouge Park due to its unique urban setting and the large percentage of historic land disturbance. Conservation of nature is clearly one of the main objectives of Rouge National Urban Park, and the integrated management approach is very much in keeping with internationally defined standards for the conservation of protected areas. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the legislative framework for the Rouge National Urban Park meets the definition of a Category 5 protected area under the International Union for Conservation of Nature's stringent criteria. This category of protected area applies where the interaction of people and nature over time has produced an area of distinct character with significant ecological, biological, cultural, and scenic value. This is exactly, Mr. Speaker, what Rouge National Urban Park represents. And I will commit to you, Mr. Speaker, that Parks Canada will see to it that all of this park's unique components live up to the highest international conservation standards and receive the strongest ever legal protections in the history of the Rouge. Integration is tailor-made for this unique landscape and is the right way forward for Rouge National Urban Park. Integration allows us to protect and to appreciate for eternity, if you will, for future generations, the striking colors of sugar maples in the Rouge's Carolinian forests in the fall, while also enjoying fresh maple syrup made by the Rouge's heritage farmers every spring. In other words, our integrated approach is just about as Canadian as you can get, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in light of this historic occasion and in the spirit of coming together for the public good to create a lasting legacy for Ontarians, Canadians, and citizens of the world, I would urge all members to support the bill before the House today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Scarborough, Rouge River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his speech and his work in the Rouge River area, the Rouge Valley. My question to him, because I know he was at the original visioning exercise for the creation of the Rouge National Park, and I know he briefly mentioned it, and I was there, and the one biggest vision at this visioning exercise was to ensure that this was the people's park. And so my question to him, and it's for all of his colleagues who were on the committee, and when the opposition put forward an amendment, a very simple amendment, that would dedicate this park to the people of Canada, why did the Conservatives vote against it, Mr. Speaker? And why did they not want to make the main vision that was making it the people's park at the first visioning exercise, which he was there and I was there? Why did the Conservatives vote against dedicating this park to the people of Canada?
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would thank my honourable colleague for the question, and indeed I would thank her for her support from day one, virtually, as when we met in the very early days of beginning to plan for the park that will fulfill the dreams of Ontarians that Ontarians have held in and around this area and beyond for decades now. To the point of her question, I would say that it is sometimes possible to overthink the legislative process. We've made clear, Parks Canada has made clear, the Parks Canada leadership, I think she will agree, has been magnificent over the past couple of years as we've moved forward through various stages in consultation and planning. But I think, Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying, and I mean this is a classic example of something that does go without saying, that the Rouge National Urban Park will indeed be a people's park, and it will be unique in that it will be available by public transit to fully 20% of the Canadian population. A wonderful springboard for those newer Canadians who might not have had a chance to experience our traditional parks as a springboard to more traditional protected areas.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his speech. And it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because all of the parties voted to send this to committee in the anticipation that there might be some discussion and possibly even some amendments to the bill to satisfy some of the concerns that were out there prior to the vote. But as it turns out, the government was not interested in any of the amendments as presented, and in fact trashed a number of the witnesses that came who had slightly different views. So I wanted to, the honourable member spent a lot of time talking about ecological integrity and then ecological health. And he says, for actually arguably good reasons, that this bill could not adhere to the ecological integrity standard of a park that we would expect in Canada. Fine, we'll buy that argument. So the replacement standard is ecological health, which is referenced in clauses 4 and 6. Fine. So you should look and find a definition of what ecological health means. Presumably, it's a downgraded standard from ecological health, or ecological integrity. So I asked my honourable colleague, can he point to any definition of what ecological health is for this park, or is it really anything the minister says it is?
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Well, and Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for his question, and I know that down deep he does have the best interests at heart for this wonderful new protected space, which is very close to his constituency. I think again, Mr. Speaker, the fact that, as I mentioned in my remarks, fully 75% of the lands that will be enshrined and protected under this new unique national urban park have been destroyed, not destroyed, in some cases have been seriously affected by civilization. There's an old garbage landfill in the area which is part of the history of the area. There are wonderful archaeological deposits in different parts of the park. There's an old auto wreckers shop where the land has been seriously, significantly polluted, which will have to be seen to in the course of time. And I think that when it comes to the definition of ecological integrity as it is applied and as it is respected by Parks Canada in our more traditional parks, where there is space, where fires, natural fires and floods are allowed to take place, to renew, to revitalize those parks, are simply inappropriate in this particular setting. I think that the definition of ecological health doesn't have to be, and again I come back to the point of my previous honourable colleague's question, there is a tendency sometimes in committee to overwrite legislation, to be specific with things that really should go without saying. And I think that the fact that Parks Canada has accepted stewardship of this new urban protected space, this unique space, the fact that the National Park Plan, which every park must have, is already in draft form and is available for reference by my colleague and others, will more than reassure those who may be at doubt as to the definition of ecological health.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague for his excellent speech. And I wanted to see what his comments would be in regards to well, we all know shamefully the Liberals have a history of playing politics with the Rouge. It dates back to the Trudeau Liberals of the 1970s. And unfortunately, most recently, we have Liberal Minister Brad Dougall of Ontario. He made it clear in a letter he wrote to the Minister of the Environment on September the 3rd, insisting on the concept of ecological integrity in the legislation, and that without amendments, he would not recommend transferring the provincial lands over to the federal government. Mr. Speaker, here we are at third reading with no amendments that were brought forward, and my question to my colleague is the government even interested in working with the province of Ontario? Because we've seen the hypocrisy. It's unbelievable. And the Liberal government doesn't even bring it up to its own standards that they profess to have. So I would like to ask him, should Ontario bring these lands up to the standards they profess to have before any lands are transferred and accepted by the federal government in this park?
The honourable member of Scarborough-Guildwood, rising on a point of order.
I don't wish to quibble with my honourable colleague, but he said that no amendments were brought forward. He and I were there while 18 amendments were brought forward. I would think that, as a point of order and point of information, he would want to correct himself with respect to that.
That clearly is not a point of order. It is a debating issue. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I must say, in responding to my honourable colleague, that I personally have been disappointed by the behaviour of the Ontario government, not just in recent months, but over the course of years. In my previous incarnation, ministers of the Ontario government tried to hold to ransom transfer of the lands under their authority, which would be and will become part of the urban Rouge Urban National Park. And they have been very unhelpful in recent days in trying to imply somehow that their conservation standards, their protection standards are higher than Parks Canada. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the loopholes in Ontario's Greenbelt Act and the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Act grandfather environmentally destructive practices which allow exemptions so that if endangered species are killed in the interests of the government of the day, if a net benefit is provided, they have a very loose system of permitting, and it suggests that the Ontario government, in fact, would perhaps be better focused on raising the lands under their current authority to the standards which will be required and overseen by Parks Canada.